सामने करो नहीं सर वो कहने का अपना भेज रहे उनसे वेट कर लो बार अब यार तो लग जाएगी
सर वो है भी पिक्चर रिकॉर्ड है
ठीक है अभी तो बात क्या तो वो ना जी हमें चंडीगढ़ यूनिवर्सिटी जॉब में
तो इसको थोड़ा पीछे कर सकते हैं हम लाइट को
exalted legal luminaries in our presence, and we should start with a small video of the Chandigarh University, after which we shall carry on with the program. Very, very warm welcome to all of those participating amidst us. And with that, we could start with the video. The introductory video about the Chandigarh University.
When I drove through the complex of the Chandigarh University, I couldn't believe this is a university that started barely 7 years ago.
Well, it's been a remarkable morning. I wasn't expecting anything quite as big as that. Well, I wish you well in your careers. It's obviously a very lively and progressive university, and I hope you'll make the most of that because it's an enormous opportunity.
Wonderful. Wonderful. This is a wonderful university. As such, I have gotten some of my education in India, and it gives a very unique feeling coming here.
आपका विश्वविद्यालय बहुत अच्छा नैक जब मैं समीक्षा करता हूं तो आपका विश्वविद्यालय हमारी नैक में भी A+ है और जब देखता हूं कि आपका शोध अनुसंधान और पेटेंट की दिशा में भी तो जो मेरी जानकारी में लाया गया आप नंबर 1 हैं पेटेंट में तो इस बड़ी उपलब्धि के लिए कम समय में शीर्ष उपलब्धि को अर्जित करना ये इस बात को प्रदर्शित करता है कि आप एक जुनून के साथ एक मिशन मोड में शिक्षा के लिए समर्पित होकर के काम कर रहे हैं और इसलिए मैं आपको शुभकामना देना चाहता हूं।
Thank you so much. And again, I'd like to welcome everyone who's in attendance. I'm sure you were enthralled by the video that has been played to showcase the achievements that Chandigarh University has achieved over the short time span that it has been in existence. With that being said, I'd like to welcome Honorable Mr. Justice Swatantra Kumar, under whose aegis this international webinar on global challenges of modern times has been organized. The inaugural and technical session that shall follow Honorable Mr. Justice Swatantra Kumar's address shall be incomplete without his very, very welcome address that he has in store for us. So with that, Honorable Mr. Justice Swatantra Kumar.
Good morning. Good morning to all of you. As the chairperson of the Academic Advisory Board of the University of the Institute of Legal Studies, Chandigarh University, it gives me immense pleasure to welcome you all today to the Judges Conference of 2021 at Chandigarh. The two-day conference, which is being organized today and tomorrow, will be based on the theme, Global Challenges of Modern Times, and the well-covered various aspects related to the contemporary issues and challenges which exist in the globe today. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I really, on behalf of the university and myself, and particularly the chairman, the Chancellor of the university, Mr. Sandhu, I welcome all of you to this august gathering of people, distinguished judges, professors, and the dignitaries and invitees from different parts of the world. Today we have a direct audience of nearly 1,500 attending it, and 25,000 people are in reach. With this background, I would first like to introduce and say a few words about the extremely distinguished people who are going to chair the session and speak on the topics. Well, if I really start speaking truly about each one of them, probably the session would be over without any of them speaking at all. So I would confine myself to a very introductory aspect of all the honorable dignitaries who are speaking on this session. Just to give you an outline, we have 4 sessions, 2 today, 2 tomorrow. Each one of them is presided over by an honorable judge of the Supreme Court of India and distinguished judges from various parts of the world, and the professors are there to tell us what it is. The purpose of this webinar is twofold. One is to spread academic growth among the young blood today and the distinguished attendees of this webinar. Second is to have the knowledge of such highly expertise people from the world and their wisdom shared in these few moments to the benefit not only of the student community, the faculty, the distinguished invitees, but for the globe as such. Honorable Mr. Justice Suryakant is true to his name. As you all know, Surya obviously means the sun. Sun has 2 folds, the light and the heat. And believe me, ladies and gentlemen, he is a young judge who has both these elements. He spreads light of justice to the people right in the remotest corners of our country. And secondly, he carries that heat which people watch and really respect his uprightness in his professional career. His concern from the environment, since we are concerned with this, in the recent judgment of Jitendra Singh in 2019, he has cared about the water bodies and spread the message how important is such a small thing like water body for the benefit of the humanity. Justice Suryakant has been a great judge, has been the Chief Justice of the High Court of Himachal Pradesh, one of the most beautiful states of our country. And I really welcome him and thank him for sparing his time for this international webinar. Most welcome, Justice Suryakant, to this webinar, please. We have Justice Sabrina Mckenna. Oh, she is a great lady. She comes from Hawaii, and she not only brings the good looks of Hawaii, but she brings the good feeling of Hawaii in his judicial work as well as in her deliberation with people at large. Madam Sabrina, I really welcome you on behalf of the university to this webinar. Well, then we have our dear friend, Justice Ben Preston, who is the Chief Judge of the Land and Environmental Court of South Wales. His concerns about environment and his knowledge on environment, be it climate change, be it environmental damage, be it holding of industrial responsibilities, is immense. He has worked widely and is world known for his contribution to environmental law. Justice Preston, I really welcome you to this webinar and thank you for being here. We have then Madam Irum Shan, who is a great person in the ADB, and she is very active in the field of environment and believes in strengthening the environment and climate change adjudication and enforcement. Therefore, I really welcome her. We have Professor Dumanto Amiratane and Professor M.T. Ledden, who is Director General and CEO. And we have these distinguished professors who have years of knowledge, not only restricted in one field of academia, but in widespread thinking process, and they have probably taught and brought up generations and generations for the benefit of the globe. I welcome both of them for having spared their time and have come to this webinar. I would say one thing, that we are today in a global situation where we need to really concern ourselves about these modern challenges of the modern times. Whether be it COVID-19, whether it be water issue, whether it be the intergenerational equity principle applicable at the global level, or the right to education, all these are very sensitive topics. The right to education is a very concerned topic for the developing countries, while other aspects are very important for the developed countries. So it's a real combination where we do bring to the notice of and knowledge of all the young blood today and all attendees whom I welcome particularly, that this webinar is being organized by the distinguished Chandigarh University. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much, Justice Kumar, and thank you for your gracious words, and thank you for your kind words for the welcome address. I must also make the audiences aware that we are extremely lucky to have Justice Kumar, under whose aegis this webinar is being organized, because Justice Kumar himself has been emblematic of the judicial excellence that India has come to be known for over the last couple of decades. It must also be pointed out that during his tenure as a judge of the High Court in Delhi, Chandigarh, Bombay, and then a judge of the Supreme Court, and then the chairperson of the National Green Tribunal, environment has achieved greater heights, more than any of us could have imagined in this large country of India. So thank you so much, Justice Kumar, for your gracious words. Without any further ado, we'd like to invite Professor Dr. R.S. Baba, the Pro-Chancellor of the Chandigarh University, who could probably share a few words about the university itself.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to appreciate and welcome, a hearty welcome to Honorable Lordships, Honors, distinguished professors, and on behalf of the university, Mr. Justice Lordship Santara Kumarji also. He is the actually brain behind this event, and you have had a small glimpse of the university. I'll just share a couple of thoughts about the university. First of all, the university is providing a very inspirational model to all the students and its faculty. And I'm sure the distinguished dignitaries will appreciate that today's event is going to be very, very motivational and inspirational for all, not only those who are interested in law or in environment, but everybody. The university has been adjudged as the youngest and the fastest growing university of Asia. Then also, as have been said already, apart from accreditation, the university has tie-up with foreign universities across 67 countries. There are 308 partnerships, and this puts us at #1 in the country in terms of partnerships. And with many universities, we have exchange of faculty, students, and also joint degree programs. Also, in terms of patents, I would like to share the numbers. We have filed more than 900 patents in the last 5 years. And last year, we filed 346 patents, which put us at #1 in a single year. Distinguished delegates, also, Chandigarh University is also awarded the University with Best Placements Award. And the reason is that we are in the Limca Book of Records for highest number of companies visiting a campus in a single year. When it was 360. Last year, 691 companies came for campus placement. 6,617 students got placed, and the highest package was 35 lakhs. The university provides scholarships to all needy and distinguished and deserving students worth about 33 crores annually. And also, we take pride in the fact that we are a mini India and a mini globe at this campus. We have students from all 28 states of India, all 8 union territories, and 45 foreign countries also. And all these things put together in terms of research, in terms of startups, we have a TBI. There are only 7 technology business incubators which have been funded by the Government of India and recognized by Government of India. And in the northern region, we are the only one. We have 37 industry-sponsored labs on the campus. And through this TBI, our 117 students have their own startups. Some of them earning more than 1 crore per year. So once again, a very hearty welcome on behalf of the Honorable Chancellor, Das Ram Singh Sandhuji, and on behalf of the whole Chandigarh University fraternity. And we are beholden to you for having chosen to be a part of this webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Baba. And again, thank you so much for organizing this and hosting this and bringing so many legal luminaries under one roof through your wonderful university. We'll probably hear more about the university in the coming sessions as well, as we hope to do. But without any further ado, let me please request our today's chief guest and keynote speaker, Honorable Mr. Justice Surikant, the Judge of the Supreme Court of India. His Lordship Justice Kumar has already spoken about Justice Surikant, and I could not add anything further. So with that, I'd like to welcome Justice Surikant for his official keynote address.
Thank you. Thank you. A very good morning to everyone. Justice Swatantra Kumar, former Judge of the Supreme Court of India. Justice Sabrina Mckenna, Associate Justice Supreme Court of the State of Hawaii. Justice Brian Preston, Chief Justice of the Land and Environment Court of New South Wales. Ms. Uram Ehsan, Professor Domenico and Professor M.T. Ledden in absentia. Vice Chancellor, Professor Dr. R.S. Bawa, Professor Chaturvedi, other distinguished speakers, my dear students, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me immense pleasure to speak today at this international webinar on global challenges of modern times, organized by the Chandigarh University. Out of the variety of topics offered by the university, I have decided to share my views on the subject of right to education in the present times of India. The importance of education to every individual and its wider role for the society means that education has always been the preoccupation of thinkers since antiquity. For an overview of the philosophy of education, including the ideas of prominent thinkers such as Plato, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, or John Dewey, often face questions that have been the subject of debate over the centuries. And they are, what should be the aims of education? What should education be implemented? How should students be taught? And what should education focus on the acquisition of knowledge or skills? Education, like the second sun that it is, ensures that people have the basic understanding of their rights, duties, and an effective instrument for them to avail their individual and collective rights. Therefore, one has to discover the infinite horizons of enlightenment that the simplicity of learning has to offer. Well, the idea of learning cannot be limited to the mere gains of basic reading and writing, and a student should go beyond the literality of words and explore the true lessons of life. Education is an intrinsic part of one's personality, and it helps in shaping a person's understanding of the world, their ability to think, and influence their identity. It plays a vital role in how individuals engage or choose not to in political and civil spaces, and thus impacts on their civil and political rights. Given the importance of education for social and national development, it is important to speak on socio-legal ramification and right to education in the present times, especially when the education system is facing one of the largest disruptions of history in consequence to the pandemic. Since 1948, a great number of states, including India, have made persistent efforts to enshrine the right to education as a basic human right in their highest legal order. The interdependent and interlinked nature of human rights makes education as a key to unlock enjoyment of an individual's such rights. The importance of education is most evident in the fact that those who are perceived to be educated are more likely to be aware of their human rights and know how to assert them. Given the nature of education, the fact that it empowers and is relevant in many domains of people's lives means that education plays a unique and fundamental role in the realization of one's human rights. Education plays key role in empowering people to enjoy and exercise their rights and also to respect the rights of others besides performing their fundamental duties. Education can be transformative, not just for an individual, but also for the state and society. It carries special importance for the physical and emotional well-being of marginalized or oppressed groups. In Indian context, education empowers the girls to defy harmful cultural practices and resist every element of inequality. The educated women and girls surely dismantle the barriers and walls of gender-based discrimination, biases, or physical and emotional exploitation. The right to education, empowering every child to education of a certain quality as a legally vested right, has been introduced to India quite recently. In 1911, great social reformer Gopal Krishna Gokhale had first moved the Free and Compulsory Education Bill in the Imperial Legal Assembly, known as the then Imperial Legislative Assembly, which faced stiff resistance from members belonging to the privileged classes. And since then, it has taken us a 100-year-long battle for the Right to Education Act to be born. Although the bill was eventually rejected, Gokhale's efforts brought a great deal of public and administrative discourse and focus on the issue. Right to education, though, was not included as a fundamental right by the Constituent Assembly, maybe due to the economic and financial abilities of the state, but it was placed under Part 4 of the Constitution as a directive principle of state policy through Article 45 of the Constitution, with a promise that the state shall strive hard to achieve this goal. It was during 1980-90s that India saw various social movements and initiatives being launched aimed towards free and compulsory education. The Supreme Court proactively, in the case of Mohini Jain versus State of Karnataka, for the first time recognized and construed right to education as a fundamental right under Article 21 of the Constitution and as an integral part of right to life. The Supreme Court held that although the right to education was not expressly guaranteed by the Constitution, nonetheless, it was essential to realize this fundamental right to life and human dignity guaranteed by our Constitution. The court drew force from the preamble of the Constitution and directive principles of the state policy under the Constitution so as to advance the constitutional goal. Later on, the Constitutional Bench of the Supreme Court in J.P. Unni Krishnan versus State of Andhra Pradesh crystallized the scope of free and compulsory education for a child until they complete 14 years of age. Beyond that age, the right to education was to be circumscribed by limits of economic capacity of the state. It was long thereafter that the Parliament-wide 86th Constitutional Amendment introduced Article 21A as a fundamental right to education. It is significant to note that RTE is the first instance where the Parliament took active steps to incorporate a directive principle of state policy as a standalone fundamental right, highlighting the paramount importance of education as a means to securing individual autonomy and dignity. As an attempt to widen the scope of education and improve its quality, the right to information and the right to education provides the essential legal framework to fix responsibility when children are denied the right to education. By insisting on 8 years of compulsory schooling, the Right to Education Act recognizes the importance of the elementary stage with continuity of curriculum rather than a separate primary and upper primary stage. Later on, the Constitution bench, a large segment of children, especially in the age group of 11 to 14 years, drop out of the school system and give into child labor to support their families. A significant proportion of girls do not continue beyond primary school as the socially constructed clutches of gender roles engulf their fate. In order to ensure that such children are not deprived of education due to varied socio-economic factors, the state has, from time to time, introduced several policies. One such policy is the midday meal program, which was launched a method of encouraging children to attend school rather than working at factories. It further aims towards improving the nutritional status of children. The Right to Education Act envisions to eradicate the social evil of child labor, prohibit corporal punishment, and dissuade the practice of failing children. It also acknowledges the social reality of discrimination of marginalized and oppressed groups, their access to schooling and protection to equal treatment of every child to achieve the constitutional goals. India has adopted the INCON Declaration for Education 2030 and reaffirmed that education is a public good, a fundamental human rights, and a basis for guaranteeing the realization of other rights. This Incheon Declaration took place in South Korea, as I may point out. However, one of the big challenges for the Indian education system is how to imbibe the public good nature of education and strengthen its implementation in government schools. There are a few instances of other nations who have taken a different path to uphold the principle of equality with quality. For example, the Finland education system emphasis on high quality teacher education, common schools with similar standards for all children, trust in the public school system, and a strict ban on privatization of pedagogic services. This common school system has not prevented the Finnish school, as they call this, these are schools, from being one of the top educational performers in the world. It's quite encouraging that similar attempts are being made by a few Indian states as well. This is not a call for imitation, but an assertion of what is possible. Each context would have to finally evolve its own unique model, overcoming the constraints that make the delivery so weak today and emerge victorious from the storm of stagnation. The discussion around right to education finds more relevance in the present COVID situation, where accessibility and availability has become major challenges to the education system. Unfortunately, when the schools are shut down and classes move online, social and economic inequalities tends to be aggravated. While the transition to online education has been comparatively smooth in developed countries due to availability of necessary infrastructure and technology, the developing countries have experienced varied difficulties. These have indeed been challenging times. Nevertheless, I must commend the civil society and especially the educators and the parents in the manner in which schools, education institutions, and households in India have utilized, developed, and adopted technology and online method of teaching and learning in these trying times. Lastly, I wish to say that living instrument approach to interpretations adopted by courts on various aspects of the right to education contribute to a better understanding of its normative content and state's obligations in light of changing societal values. For instance, in a recent case, the Constitutional Court of Colombia evolved a pragmatic approach to ensure freedom of expression to a transgender student within the school. The court reasoned that the school is obliged to treat the student according to his gender identity. The decision promotes inclusive growth, equality, and the free development of a young mind in the school compound. There cannot be any doubt that the learning approach defined by the right to education must be in conformity with the constitutional values. The solitary object should be a holistic welfare of the child, focusing on psychological, cognitive, and physical strengths. The learning process need to be founded upon the child's activities, self-reflection, and exploration in a child-friendly manner. Such learning does require that the teaching environment is free of fear, trauma, and anxiety so as to enable the child's free flow of expression. At this departing note, I believe it will be appropriate to leave you all with the words of a man who has deeply influenced me. When Nelson Mandela was asked about the value of education, he famously said, and I quote, "Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world," unquote. I do believe that education is the ideal medium to bring about positive social changes in the communities around us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Justice Surikant. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure having you, and your words on the holistic nature and the comprehensive nature of education, right from its history to what is happening currently in Colombia, both nationally and internationally, I'm sure will inspire everyone in attendance and will stay with us for a long time to come. Thank you so much for your address, Your Lordship. We would continue with our program, and it is my absolute pleasure to invite Honorable Justice Sabrina Mckenna, who is also the co-chair of the session, and as you all know, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the state of Hawaii in the US, And I'd invite Her Lordship to continue with her address, if I may.
Thank you. Honorable Justices and co-panelists, administrators of Chandigarh University, and members of the audience, aloha from Honolulu, Hawaii. I am Justice Sabrina Mckenna of the Supreme Court of the State of Hawaii, which is the 50th state in the United States of America. It is an island state in the middle of the Northern Pacific Ocean. The backdrop of my screen is our building, Ali'iolani Hale, where the Supreme Court is located on the second floor. And I hope that some of you might come visit us in Hawaii someday. I am honored to be asked to participate in this international webinar on the global challenges of modern times. Today, I will speak on topic 2, the need for nuclear energy and environmental protection, the global dilemma of the present times. This topic requires consideration of the need for clean energy balanced against potential environmental impacts. With respect to the need for clean energy, according to the World Nuclear Association, electricity demand is increasing twice as fast as overall energy use and is likely to rise by more than half by 2040. Thus, the entire world, including India, needs to increase energy and production in order to provide electricity to its citizens. But like most of the world, India's electricity sector is still dominated by fossil fuels, in particular coal, which I understand during the 2018 to 2019 fiscal year produced about 3/4 of India's electricity. India's priority has understandably been economic growth and to alleviate poverty. India's reliance on coal, however, has not made carbon dioxide emission reduction a high priority. But the 2019 edition of BP's Energy Outlook projected India's energy consumption rising by 156% between 2017 and 2040. It predicts that India's energy mix will evolve slowly to 2040, with fossil fuels still accounting for 79% of demand in 2040, down from 92% in 2017. In actual terms, between 2017 and 2040, primary energy consumption from fossil fuels in India is apparently expected to increase by 120%. But global warming is happening, and scientists agree that the burning of fossil fuels like coal and oil all over the world over the last century is the major cause of climate change. What is going to happen to civilization if we do not meet the goal of the Paris Agreement to hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees in order to significantly reduce the risks and impacts of climate change? If global average temperature increases by 3 degrees over pre-industrial levels, rainfall in Central America and Mexico would decline by 50%. Deserts are going to spread throughout Europe, and the Alps will have no glaciers. Much of my city, Honolulu, Miami, Florida, Osaka, Japan, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and Shanghai, China, is going to be submerged underwater. Added heat will cause equatorial megacities such as Karachi and Kolkata to become nearly uninhabitable. Bangladesh, with a population of 160 million people, will be uninhabitable. Climate refugees are projected to be in the hundreds of millions. What is that going to mean for India? Now, climate naysayers in the United States question the idea that climate change is an existential threat. But if these catastrophes happen based on a 3-degree increase, even if humans survive, what is going to happen to civilization and the rule of law as we know it? Thus, the entire world must turn away from fossil fuels and to renewable energy sources, which play a vital role in securing sustainable energy with lower emissions. Now, the first nuclear power station started operating in the 1950s. Nuclear energy now provides about 10% of the world's electricity from about 440 nuclear power reactors. Nuclear energy is the world's second largest source of low carbon power, providing 29% in 2018. With respect to clean energy, studies show that nuclear energy emits among the lowest amount of carbon dioxide equivalent per unit of energy produced when considering total life cycle emissions. The reality is that almost all reports on future energy supply from major organizations suggest an expanded role for nuclear power, along with growth in other forms of low carbon power generation to create a sustainable future energy system. In June 2019, the OECD's International Energy Agency published a report concluding that a failure to invest in existing and new nuclear power plants in advanced economies would make global efforts to transition to a cleaner energy system drastically harder and more costly. Now, with respect to India, I understand that because India's weapons program, until 2009, it was largely excluded from trade in nuclear plant and materials, which hampered India's development of civil nuclear energy. But that the Indian government has committed to growing its nuclear power capacity as part of its massive infrastructure development program. And India currently plans to increase the contribution of nuclear energy to overall electricity generation capacity from 4.2% to 9% within 25 years. I understand you have 5 nuclear reactors under construction and that you plan to construct 18 additional nuclear reactors, which is the second highest in the world, by 2025. This increase in nuclear power is part of India's goals to reduce the carbon emissions by 33 to 35%, as well as to increase the clean energy electricity capacity of 40% of the total installed capacity in the same period by 2030. But what about the potential environmental impacts of nuclear energy? Globally, there have been at least 99 civilian and military recorded nuclear power plant accidents from 1952 to 2009. The world's worst nuclear accident was the 1986 Chernobyl disaster. At least 57 accidents and severe incidents have occurred since Chernobyl, and 56 have happened in my country, the United States. The consequences of a nuclear accident cannot be ignored. As the recent Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan, which is actually the country of my birth and childhood, as that made clear, the costs are potentially enormous. Fukushima's costs are estimated to rise to $75.7 billion US. Unfortunately, the Fukushima nuclear accident cast more doubt on nuclear safety. Although the nuclear power industry has improved safety and performance of reactors and has proposed new safer reactors and designs, there is no guarantee that the reactors will be designed, built, and operated correctly. The French Atomic Energy Commission has concluded that technical innovation cannot eliminate the risk of human errors in nuclear plant operation. And additionally, concerns are expressed of catastrophic scenarios involving terrorist attacks. Nuclear accidents have resulted in property damage costs for destruction of property, emergency response, environmental remediation, evacuation, lost product, fines, and court claims. Because nuclear power plants are large and complex, accidents on site tend to be expensive. On the other hand, relatively few accidents have involved direct fatalities, although concerns are expressed about cancer rates and birth defects. But when we consider the environmental challenges of nuclear energy, do we also need to consider the environmental challenges of not quickly converting to clean energy? What about the costs of climate change, the existential threat to humanity and civilization? And what about the environmental costs of air pollution from greenhouse gas emissions from coal and oil power plants? The World Health Organization estimates that about 7 million people die prematurely each year as a result of air pollution. I understand that 1.67 million deaths were attributable to air pollution in India in 2019, accounting for 17.8% of the total deaths in the country. The majority of these deaths were from ambient particulate matter pollution and household air pollution. So when we consider the environmental protection issues of nuclear power, we must also consider the environmental protection issues that arise from the continued reliance on fossil fuels. Thus, solving the global dilemma regarding the need for nuclear energy and environmental protection is not an easy one to resolve. But I'm going to close by citing to Sir David King, who served as the UK's government's Permanent Special Representative for Climate Change, who is quoted as saying this in 2014. Fukushima was a disaster, but perhaps the biggest disaster now is that Japan has switched off 46 nuclear power stations and replaced those with coal-powered power stations. I'm so sorry. And the lessons from Fukushima have to be learned by the nuclear industry. Imagine if another jumbo jet fell out of the air and 600 people were killed. Would we stop flying? Or would we improve the safety of the plane? So therefore, I think there is much to be thought about in terms of nuclear energy and environmental protection. It is a true dilemma that you, the members of the audience, the future of India, must consider. Thank you for the opportunity to address you on this critically important topic, and I look forward to hearing from the other speakers.
Thank you so much, Justice Mckenna. Thank you for sounding a clarion call against climate change as eloquently as you always do. Thank you so much for gracing this occasion with such empirically driven talk of experiential learning from around the globe, and also discussing how India can be a climate leader going forward if it concentrates on the right forms of energy. So thank you so much, Justice Mckenna. I'd move on to Justice Brian Preston, but before I do that, let me also inform all of our audiences that at 11 a.m. we would be taking 2 minutes silence because it is the Martyrs' Day, and we would be observing 2 minutes silence at 11 a.m. So in about 14 minutes. I'd request all of our attendees to kindly stand up, participants to kindly stand up and observe the 2 minute silence in honor of all the martyrs who've lost their lives for the great cause. With that being said, I would welcome Honorable Justice Brian Preston, Chief Judge of the Land and Environment Court of New South Wales, Australia. It is an absolute pleasure having you with us, Honorable Justice Preston, and I welcome you to deliver your address. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Just need to get my right slides here. This one here. Good. Good. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be presenting in this wonderful lineup of speakers. It's a fantastic program that you've got together. I'm going to sort of talk about climate consciousness and the law, and I'm going to do it in two ways. Firstly, I'll start very briefly with saying we are in a climate crisis. I think Justice Mckenna clearly put that case. Now, that climate crisis can either engender consciousness of the problem, so climate consciousness, but unfortunately, as we've seen in certain countries, of which Australia can be one and the United States another, a blindness to the climate crisis. But what I want to explore is how either that climate consciousness or climate blindness can influence the law. And it can do it in two ways. Firstly, there can be this impact of climate consciousness on the law itself. But conversely, the law can feed back and actually influence climate consciousness of society. And I want to have a look at those. Now, as far as the climate crisis, as Mr. Mckenna sort of put it forward, I think we're all well aware of the problem that the planet is facing a climate emergency. And I put on these slides, which I'm happy to make available, that 11,000 scientists looked at all of the science and said we are in a state of emergency. In Australia, of course, you probably have seen we've had horrific bushfires in the last year or so. Some of the biggest fires, the smoke from the fires was so great it encircled the globe. It blanketed New Zealand, which is a country to the east of Australia, and had a terrible effect. On every indicator, you look at it, you can see those indicators are going up, they're showing increased problems, or if they're going down, it doesn't show an improvement, it shows a different indicator which is also showing a problem. Now that climate consciousness does raise concern, and that same 11,000 scientists talked about the responses that we see. But unfortunately, it hasn't always led to a good consciousness. That is, that people are becoming aware of the need to take action to mitigate climate change in the future, but adapt to the climate change that has already occurred. Unfortunately, in some jurisdictions, they are indifferent to this crisis, or at worst, antipathetic to it. As I said, I want to really explore how this climate consciousness can have a relationship with the law. And in the presentation, I explore this at the level of international law. I look at national and subnational law and how the three arms of government, the legislature, executive, and judiciary, can respond to climate consciousness. But the one I want to spend some little bit of time on is, of course, the one which I've got the most influence, and that is courts. I'm going to skip through to that, where we get to there. So what we can see is that with society's change, if there is climate consciousness in society, can that have an influence on the law? And the answer to that is yes. A former Chief Justice of Australia, the Honourable Robert French, said in an address in the last year or so that, you know, the question is often asked of which comes first, the chicken or the egg, but he says, well, societal change always comes first. And so where there is that societal change, there is a demand on the courts to respond to that societal change. Well, how does this happen? And in the presentation, I do explore the different ways in which judicial decision-making can be seen to respond to this change of attitude in society. And I do that by looking at some of the well-known jurisprudence that we see. One is HLA Hart and another is Dworkin. They talk about there can be a response in easy cases and hard cases. Now, easy cases are where there's no dispute about what the law says or how it applies to a particular set of facts. Hard cases are where it is difficult to ascertain what is the law or what does the law mean or how it applies to a particular set of facts. That's a useful way of just exploring how societal change can influence judicial decision-making. So let's start with the easy cases. Well, obviously the courts are able to find what is the relevant law. That's why it's an easy case. But if it's legislation, and most environmental cases do deal with legislation, then the legislation actually embodies norms. And those norms of society are found in the legislation. So legislation is normative. And if the legislature and the executive have responded to changes in society, such as climate consciousness, then those norms in the legislation will reflect that climate consciousness of society. So when courts come to apply that normative legislation, then they too are applying the norms of society. What about hard cases? So this is where there needs to be ascertained what is the relevant law, or what does the law mean. Now, there are different ways in which the courts can be seen to go about this process. And I've compared Hart compared to Dworkin. So Hart suggests that judges do make law, and that's interstitial, but Dworkin suggests they don't make law, but they instead find the law. But when you look at these jurists, what they say is that both means do take into account moral considerations. And moral considerations include society's attitudes, which can include climate consciousness. So either way, we can see that judges will take into consideration considerations of justice, social policy, and moral standards. So insofar as climate consciousness infect those considerations, then we can see that societal change will place these demands on the court's adjudicative function. Now, that's all I want to say about climate consciousness influencing judicial decision-making. What about the other way around? Can judicial decision-making have an influence on the law? And I explore this by looking at the three arms of government, the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. But what I want to focus on in my oral remarks is the judiciary's role. Now, the judiciary's role can be seen to be at least fourfold. Firstly, the courts uphold and enforce the law. So they declare what is the law and they uphold the law. And of course, they sanction and remedy breaches of the law. Now, as I've said, if the law contains norms, then by the court upholding and enforcing the law, then they're upholding and enforcing those norms. Secondly, the courts uphold the rule of law. And we see this particularly in public or administrative law cases. So where the executive branch of government fails to comply with legislation, for example, then the courts hold the executive branch of government to account. And that can include the environmental and climate laws. Thirdly, courts enhance democracy. And again, we can see this in administrative law where there is judicial review. So the court can enhance democratic processes, including public participation, but there's also the quality of public administration. So compelling the executive branch of government to comply with the will of the legislature that's expressed in legislation, such as environmental and climate laws. And insofar as the court finds breach and remands the matter back to the legislature or the executive, then one can see that this puts it on the branches of government's agendas. The fourth way is that the courts uphold the norms. And I've mentioned this before, that is the norms that are embodied in the law, the courts publicize and promote those norms through their decision-making. Courts also explicate and their reasoning can expand upon what are the norms the courts uphold and expand upon the norms. My last point is this. Now, where courts make decisions in litigation concerning climate change, then those decisions can in turn raise the consciousness of society. And it can also inspire other litigation, not only in the jurisdiction of those courts, but also overseas. And I refer to that through 3 cases, and I'm only just going to highlight the effect. The first, Gender Foundation and the government of the Netherlands, the state of Netherlands. And there was a challenge by citizens that the Dutch government taking sufficiently ambitious action to abate global warming. And at first instance, in the district court in The Hague, the court upheld the claim and ordered the government to do more, that is, to reduce its emissions by to a greater extent. That decision was upheld in the Court of Appeal in The Hague, but on different reasons. They upheld the claim under human rights law, saying that there was an impact on human rights by the government failing to take the requisite action. On a further appeal to the Supreme Court of the Netherlands, the Supreme Court upheld the Court of Appeal's decision. Now that decision, or those decisions in the Netherlands have had a ripple effect. We can see it in a similar action in Belgium, where the law is very similar, but we can also see it in Germany, Sweden, and in New Zealand. My second example of this ripple effect is some actions in the United States by foundations, Our Children's Trust. They have brought over 50 different actions at state and federal levels in the United States by children, claiming, of course, intergenerational equity. And both the fact that children are bringing the action, but also the causes of action, that is in public trust and under the due process clause, have been used in other litigations around the world. So we see it in the Philippines, in Pakistan, in India, as well as in Norway, Ireland, and Colombia. And the other interesting aspect is using youth plaintiffs. The last case is the decision that I made in Australia, where there's a lot of coal mining going on, and there's a particular challenge to a coal mine, an open cut coal mine. I ultimately decided to refuse the coal mine, but one of the grounds upon which I did refuse it was the climate change effects. That decision was picked up around the world. I've put some quotes there, not only in Australia, but also in Finland and in Belgium. And the decision has been used in one of the litigations in Our Children's Trust, as well as in Canada. So that concludes the main part of my presentation. I just want to finish with this, that one of the aspects about the climate change crisis is that we need to take action to mitigate and adapt to climate change. But to do that, we have to change our mindset. And there are a variety of different ways that we do that. What I've tried to explore in the presentation is how that change of mindset can either influence the law or in turn, the law can change the mindset. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justice Preston. Thank you for being as articulate and as enlightening as ever. And I know that the presentation is a lot longer. I'd invite all of our participants and attendees to observe 2 minutes silence by standing up to observe the Martyrs' Day. And through this 2 minutes silence, we'll be able to pay our respects to the martyrs. Thank you all for observing that 2 minutes silence. As I mentioned, this is our way of respecting and paying our respects to those who've lost their lives on the battlefront. That being said, let me again thank Justice Preston for such an enlightening presentation. I'm sure it leads to a lot of good conversations as to whether consciousness leads to judicial making and whether the judicial making leads to climate consciousness, and the conversations must continue on this extremely enthralling topic. So thank you so much, Justice Preston. And as always, such an articulate and enlightening way of delivering the lecture. Thank you, Justice Preston. Without any further ado, let me call upon Ms. Iram Ehsan, who's joining us from Manila, if I'm not wrong. And for those of you who have been functioning in the environmental space, you've obviously heard of her. She has been a very big catalyst to bring judicial community together towards environment, towards climate change. For those of you who had missed out her earlier introduction by Justice Kumar, she is the advisor, Office of the Compliance Review Panel, Asian Development Bank, Philippines. And as I mentioned, an extremely active climate change warrior. So Iram, with that, I'd invite you to start with your talk, if you may.
Thank you so much, Ishan, and Justice Sutendra Kumar for just such a kind and generous introduction. But I think the warrior is the right word. I'm just a warrior fighting all the battles that whichever comes my way. But honored and really happy to be here. Thank you, Chandigarh University. Thank you, Honorable Justice Sutendra Kumar, and all the friends and participants here who considered me for this lecture. We go back so many years, all of the speakers here and participants here, that it's always pleasure to be with them. So I am Iram Ehsan, and I work with the Asian Development Bank, currently advising the compliance work of the bank, and I'm lawyer by profession. But previously I led the bank's law and policy reform program, under which I did work a lot with the judges, prosecutors, academia, civil society, mainly on environment, climate change, gender equality laws, but also corporate governance. And I'm a corporate lawyer by profession. All rest is my passion and my experience. Today, I'm going to speak on an issue which is very close to my heart. And I remember Justice Preston saying that you cannot talk enough about it because every time the audience is different. Hence, the audience here is someone that I haven't spoken to on this issue. And thank you, Justice Mckenna and Justice Preston, both touching on this issue prior to me. I'm really happy. And this issue is how vulnerabilities are exacerbated by climate change. And now, of course, we add the layer of pandemic to it. So whatever I say today, even if I just say climate change, please read climate change and COVID-19 to it, even if I'm not mentioning it. So moving on, Ban Ki-moon very rightly said, vulnerable people suffer the first and worst. And I think that is the crux of my today's presentation. This is not a rocket science. It's so logical. We all know about it, but it's just that human nature, we tend to ignore the most simplistic things in our lives. And I'm just here to remind everyone today about it. I will just set the scene by telling the climate change, who are vulnerable to it, what is the big picture imminent crisis, what is the state responsibility, what is the judicial responsibility, since we have so many eminent judges to work together with us. So I will touch upon a little bit of judicial responsibility as well. I'm going very fast because A, I talk very fast, and B, I have little time. But the effects of climate change or interaction of climate change with human rights is that we all know in the short term, climate change is creating erratic weather patterns, natural hazards, earthquakes, floods, etc. And in the long term, these hazards are impacting the ecosystems, habitats, and we are losing biodiversity. So what is happening here? We are having food and water security crisis, migration issues, increased vulnerabilities, and of course, poor being pushed further into poverty. What human rights are we talking about? any human right that you can possibly think of, be it right to life, health, education, water, sanitation, food, property, living, dignity, housing, mobility, nationality, and right to self-determination. Let me just tell you, give you example of right of self-determination. Simply put, it is that right of small island states to exist in their own land with dignity and with some integrity. Now, how is climate change impacting vulnerable people? Why am I bringing human rights issues and vulnerabilities and exasperation of vulnerable people through climate changes? Because climate change has different meaning for different people. For some, it is just a matter of change of weather pattern. It's a bit hot today. Isn't it a bit cold today? But for others, it is a matter of survival. Too little food, too much water, no water at all, risk to security, existence, so it is different for everyone. It is unjust, hence, because those people who are countries who have contributed very little towards climate change are suffering its effects the most. Similarly, climate change is unfair because some countries can fight against erratic weather patterns, whereas poor's lives have already been upended. So, as Mary Robinson's and say very aptly, and I quote, that climate change is a threat to global peace, security, and prosperity. And I think I could not have said, and it is a global peace issue. In 2007, so many years ago, US, the superpower of the world, their military advisory board categorically stated that climate change is going to be a serious threat for America's national security. Now just compare it with the rest of the poor world and these days. So this is what I'm talking about. And I'll expand on it a little bit as I go along. Now, let me connect the dots with climate change and pandemics. And when I say pandemics, currently we are into one. So climate change has impact on pandemics. I'm not going to go into the techniques and science of it. I think there's enough material out there, at least I'm convinced, and want to convince you all the linkage between it. Hot weathers and deforestation make animals that are normally hidden in the forest or sea move to land and come in contact with other animals with whom they are not supposed to be in contact. Number one. Number two, through big farms, these animals then come in contact with human beings, and that's how infections and germs spread. This is a very layman way of connecting climate change and with the pandemic. Now, how does this what does it do to vulnerable people? It's the germs and infections harm and spread much more quickly into vulnerable people because of their living conditions and already vulnerabilities. So this is what the connection and all I wanted to make today. Now, who are these vulnerable people? Just to think of course, these are children. These are elderly and differently abled people, indigenous people, women, and please see poor people, that is cross-cutting in all of these vulnerable people's list. What are the impacts? Let me take one by one quickly. What are the impacts of climate change and pandemics? As I said, please read pandemics behind everything I say on children. Their health, number one. Children, the dangers of climate change are more pronounced for children than adults. Rising temperatures and changing weather patterns and rainfall patterns, these things exacerbate the spread of vector-borne diseases such as malaria and dengue in children, and waterborne diseases such as cholera and dysentery. In natural disaster situation, children, because of their small sizes, are less likely to fight with strength, more likely to get orphaned or separated with their parents, and hence are susceptible to trafficking as well as forced labor. Malnutrition, lack of food, lack of water, no rocket science. Of course, children suffer more malnutrition because they have lesser strength to fight with nutrition issues. Education, we all know right now how education is suffering for children. I just stop here. I don't have to go give greater details, which I used to give prior to the pandemic, like them spending more time outside of their houses, doing chores, helping their parents. All has become irrelevant with this pandemic. So, then impacts of climate change on children. I will also highlight and flash some numbers here just to bring the perspective. Nearly 160 million children live in high or extremely high drought severity zones. And these numbers are all from credible organizations and institutions. More than 88% of existing global burden of disease due to climate change occurs in children and less than 5 years of age. So this is what I'm talking about in terms of vulnerabilities. Now, next category is elderly and differently abled people. I'm just clubbing them together because issues are quite common. And so their diminished ability to adapt. Some older people may have chronic health conditions and they are bedbound. They are unable to leave home. And again, in climate change, I mean, this COVID situation, they are not allowed to leave home, even if they are physically okay. And they could be suffering from dementia, degenerative illnesses. They have very limited communication access. So they cannot, maybe bedbound, they cannot react to flood warnings. They cannot react to seek assistance in case of emergency. And then in this pandemic, as I said, I live with my 84 years old father. He's not allowed to step out of my home main door, period. So, you know, this is what I'm talking about. So high time that we all wake up, because this is just inhuman. He hasn't seen sunlight or air in so many months. So before I start crying, I move on to the next slide. Again, some numbers, 56% of those who died during Japan's 2011 tsunami were aged 65 or over. Climate change is having the largest impact on the world's poorest and most vulnerable people. And within these groups, 20% are people with disabilities. All right, Indigenous people, my next category. Indigenous people are the people who live closest to the nature. Land is their life. Environment is their life. You kill it, you kill them. And these are Indigenous people who live in small islands, who live in each and every country. India has a biggest population of Indigenous people. I come from Pakistan, so does Pakistan, Philippines. You name any country and we have Indigenous people, and how we are spoiling their lives by moving them remote from their land and their existence. Proximity to nature is their life, and we are taking that away from them. And one thing that I want to mention here is the connection with even climate change mitigation measures. They can even violate the rights of these indigenous people. For instance, biofuels are considered less gas-emitting fuels like corn, palm oil, etc. Now, what is happening is that palm oil companies are usurping the land from indigenous people and poor people by force. Colombia got the second largest internally displaced people's population, and there are many other numbers here. So while we come up with solutions for climate change and pandemics, we can actually do usurping rights of poor and vulnerable by giving solutions. So just, you know, that's what we need to really look at. Then let me talk about migration. When I talk about indigenous people and poor people and vulnerable people, they have to migrate, not just one or two people. The entire nation has to be relocated in several instances in cases of Pacific Islands. Now, there have been many cases in Australia and New Zealand where refugee claims were asked for by these islanders and refused by the courts. And in some matters, rightly so far, because the classic definition of refugee does not include the climate-induced, asylum. It is mostly linked with terrorism and national security and wars, etc. So, you know, we lack the legal definition of protection for climate refugees or climate migrants. And then add a layer to it is a migration with dignity, as I said earlier. Fine, I'm given asylum in Australia, New Zealand, France, wherever. But I am forced to leave my home, my culture, my religion, my nationality, my language, my appearance, my everything, you know, so it's not dignified migration. So there are so many layers, and judges are the custodian of rights all over. So, you know, you all have, and I completely empathize with you. You all need so much tools to be able to do justice, but I wanted to raise this because you all need to also come into this picture. Moving on, what I want to say I want to take a pause here and say, ladies and gentlemen, mind the gap, please. Climate change, minorities, and indigenous people. And moving on, last category is women. Of course, I cannot leave the podium without talking about women and impacts on their lives. And I promise I won't cry because I've been saying it for so long. I'm now kind of, acclimatized with this. Women do not own land frequently. We've seen this around the world. So they do not contribute to any decision making around land or environment or climate, right? Number one. Number two, women make 43% of the agricultural labor force and contribute to 60 to 80% of food crops in the poorest parts of the world. And yet they have the most limited access to food and agriculture produce. According to FAO, if all women smallholders receive equal access to produce, then probably the undernourished people in the world will drop to 12 to 17%, and 100 to 150 million people will no longer be hungry. Just bring women into equation and you drop numbers significantly. Similarly, due to crop failure, women are suffering and girls are suffering more than men and other kind of population in terms of malnutrition and diseases because of their physical challenges. They need to give birth. They might be pregnant. They might be ill already because they are giving food to their children and their husbands and their partners and not eating enough for themselves. Fuel shortage makes them spend more and more time outside of the house and less of the time to do chores inside of the house. Water scarcity is making them walk kilometers and kilometers with heavy pots of water on their heads, bending their spines, creating infertility. So talk of linkages and rocket science of women and climate change, and now pandemics, because now they are taking care of sick, elderly, differently able people at home. And not just doing chores outside. If they are displaced, imagine in a disaster situation, they are living in camps or open situations, sexual exploitation, trafficking, prostitution. I just want to stop here. So what happens is, if I'm spending, just a small example, if I'm spending more time outside doing chores and less time inside the house making chapatis and breads and delicious food for the family, I get slapped by my husband or my partner because I'm not providing food in time and delicious enough food. So that is what is the linkage between climate change induced issues and domestic violence. Now I come to pandemic. What are the causes of violence? Are the causes of what pandemic is? The causes of pandemic as well as violence is stress, disruption of social and protective networks, isolation, restricted movement and stay-at-home measures. These all lead to economic hardships, decreased access to services, and these all then exacerbate violence, not only just the pandemics. So this is the linkage between pandemics, women, and so again, some numbers. An average of 77% of fatalities in 2004 tsunami were women. You know why? Because they did not know how to swim. Teach your girls how to swim, please. It's no more luxury. It's a life-saving skill. 300% increase in new domestic violence cases only after 2 cyclones hitting Tafe province in Vanuatu in 2011. COVID-19 domestic violence is called a shadow pandemic by UN Women. So domestic violence is a pandemic inside of the pandemic. That's what I'm trying to say. Big picture, my dear friends, we are in imminent crisis. Women, children, vulnerable people are dying much more than COVID-induced deaths. So we already had that pandemic, and then we were hit by another pandemic in itself. State responsibility is simply state is legally bound to address climate-related or pandemic-related vulnerabilities in accordance with the principles of equity and non-discrimination. We are entering into an era of vaccine. Let's see how states fulfill their promise of actually giving it first to the vulnerable people, frontliners. I'm waiting to see that. I'm already seeing human rights violations all around the world. I stop there, but that's another issue. Judicial responsibility. You judges, I can't say enough, and I see smirk on Justice Preston's face every time I talk about it, and other judges, that simplest issues can come before you relating to COVID and relating to climate change, as like EIA, social responsibility reports, lack thereof, simple issues. But all these simple cases add up to your contribution in this area. Or the cases could be as complex as refugee status, migration, and you need to get ready for that. And you are already getting ready. And now vaccine-related irregularities, they are all going to land in the end in your courts, because state systems are not functioning properly. So judiciaries, people do not see judiciaries as a last resort. They see them as a first resort and run to the judiciaries for their fundamental rights protection. So you're going to get, and already it's very, very heartwarming how Asia is responding already to these issues. I read cases from India, from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, who have already stated that climate change has disproportionate impacts on women. In some cases, they talk about children. And I have list of these cases under these heads in our recent most publication that we've just launched under Asian Development Bank. It is a 4-volume book called Climate Change Coming Soon to a Court Near You. Do look up the second report, which has sections on women, children, vulnerable people, and the cases that we've collected from all around the world. So you'll get a lot of examples. So I won't go into detail. My conclusions: CC means climate change. So COVID and CC both cause global disruption, both cause cross-border impacts, both threaten the lives of millions of people. COVID and CC are risk multipliers. They exacerbate inequalities by disproportionately affecting the most vulnerable. COVID and CC pose health threats of global magnitude. CC will increase the risk of future pandemics by endangering the fragility of the world's ecosystem, says WHO. 1/3 of the world's internally displaced live in the 10 countries most at risk to COVID-19. They now face 3 crises fold into one: health crisis, a socio-economic crisis, a protection crisis against the backdrop of an ever-growing climate crisis. As Paul Kelly, an Australian singer, says, "From little things, big things grow." It's a beautiful song, and it is sung for the Aboriginal people of Australia. I believe, from these little things that we call vulnerable people, big things grow through our response towards it. And I thank you all here. And once again, thank you for giving me the opportunity. Over to you, Ishan.
Thank you so much, Iram. It's always a pleasure to listen to you. I always maintain that listening to you is like having a drawing room conversation with someone who's just as passionate as you come across as. So thank you so much. And I do stand corrected to all the audiences. Iram is not just a climate change warrior, but a human rights warrior. As you can see, if you do look her up, she has done tremendous work in women empowerment and fight against gender discrimination as well. So please do look it up. Without any further ado, and we have a time limit to adhere to, so I'll just rush through this. We have Professor Domenico Amirante, who will be speaking next. He's a full professor of public and comparative law, president of the course in political science, director of the doctoral school in comparative law, and an absolute stalwart when it comes to international conversations on such issues. So it's a pleasure having you with us, Professor Amirante. Over to you. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. And while now in Italy, the sun is just rising, it's 7 o'clock in the morning. So, but we are participating with a bunch of my PhD students from the doctoral school in comparative law. So I want to thank Justice Swatantha Kumar for the invitation, University of Chandigarh, and all the speakers that are here. And I praise very much the effort by Justice Kumar to continue with the dialogue between academicians and justices. I think it's very important, especially for the themes that we are speaking about today: environmental law and education and so on. So today I think I will be very brief. I just want to share with you an idea. In my academic work in the PhD, I use my function is just to open new paths for research, to stimulate new paths for research. So I think, and I recall the previous speaker, we really need to address. Okay. Maybe. Okay, so my brief speech will be on environmental constitutionalism, prospects and retrospects. Unfortunately, the constitutional aspects of environmental law is the least developed branch of environmental law. And I think this is a main blunder of environmental law, because we need, especially in those difficult, hard times, some guiding principles. We need to reconsider our position with respect to the guiding forces of our societies. So environmental constitutionalism, it's very important, and it's going to be a central aspect of environmental law, but also of the academic reflection. And I hope it can be an important subject for the discussions and the deliberations on constitutionalism. But let's see the dimension of environmental constitutionalism with some number. In 1989, there were only 40 constitutions containing environmental provisions. Today, out of 193 UN member states, 156 contain environmental provisions. So 81% of the world constitutional system contain environmental provision. So it's a very huge and important development of environmental law in the field of constitutional law. So that's quite important. Let's see those numbers by continent. And here we will see that in the south of the world, environmental constitutionalism is more developed than in the northern country. For example, in Africa, you have nearly 82% of the countries having environmental provision in the constitution. In the Americas, 91%, and you know very well that neither United States nor Canada have environmental provisions in the constitution. So we must say Central and South America, when we speak about Americas, it's 91%. In Asia, it's 83.33%. Only Oceania is having less environmental provisions in the constitution, and in Europe, it's a meager 73%. So that's the situation by continent, the geography of environmental constitutionalism. But what is environmental constitution and why it is underdeveloped in our reflection? We have to understand that environmental law was a discipline that was launched by international law. In fact, we have two very developed branches of environmental law that are on one side international environmental law and on the other side administrative environmental law. So what we need is to develop what is between international law and administrative law. And that would be very important for many reasons, because first of all, international environmental law is not the most appropriate level for implementing environmental rules and policies, and not even for protecting environmental rights, because it is characterized by a genetic fragmentation, with hundreds of international treaties, regional cooperation pacts, and so on and so on. that's a main point. But there are many other reasons between them, the symbolic and educational, the role of education, the role of constitutional provisions, the function of the Constitution as a guiding framework for the judicial implementation of environmental rule. I think it sound and strong constitutional protection would reinforce the role of the judiciary in protecting the environment. And also another not to be neglected effect is the effect of crystallizing environmental protection as a superior source of law. And this will be a sort of non-regression principle of the environment, because the most we crystallize environmental protection within the Constitution, the most we will have the possibility to protect it in legislation, in administration, and in the courts. So why environmental constitutionalism is it's so central? I have just said, but we have now to really understand this problem of the underestimation of environmental constitutionalism. We have to look at the history of the environmental constitution that is not often told to our students. I can just very, very briefly pass over the history of environmental constitution with three phases that we can define like that. A genetic or infant phase of environmental constitution is from the 70s to, let's say, 89, a very important date, with the first constitutions enacted in Europe, for example, the Greek constitution, the Spanish and the Portuguese constitution of the 70s, and India was one of the vanguard states with the constitutional reforms in the 70s. But this phase is characterized by a very uncertain and generic role of environmental protection within the Constitution. We have a second phase, the juvenile or adolescent phase of environmental constitution, starting from 89. The fall of the Berlin Wall, with many constitutions in Europe changing completely from the socialist constitutionalist to a democratic constitutionalist. So many constitutions adopted. We have remembered the Chernobyl disaster in '86. So the public opinion was very impressed about environmental concerns, and many constitutions adopted environmental protection, but not only in East Europe or Central Europe, but also in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. But we are now in a new phase, what we can call the adult phase of environmental constitutionalism, that is led especially by Latin America, with some new constitutions that are putting the environment at the center of the constitutional stage. So environment is not just an entry, a new entry of the constitutions like I don't know, transportations or economic development, sustainable development, and so on, but it's the center of the constitution, especially in some constitutions freshly enacted like Bolivia or Ecuador around 2008 and so on. So that's a very important change. And this new phase of environmental constitution is based on some developments that are, first of all, the discovery of the role of chthonic law and of indigenous law within a constitutional discourse, then the role of multiculturalism and diversity, so the the role of plural of legal pluralism in the framework, in the constitutional framework. So those constitutions are very innovative. And that's the problem now. The problem in front of us is how to combine this new constitutionalism with the classic and the old constitutionalism, because we may have a sort of clash between the classic, the traditional way of looking at constitutionalism that considers environment just one entry like the others, and this new constitutionalism that considers environment like a central element of the constitutional pact, of the social pact. So what do we need? We need a constitutional dialogue between politicians, between political scientists, between academicians and judges as well. It's very important. Let me conclude with the sort of, so we have a contrasted picture, that's my conclusion, but let me conclude with a sort of an omen for the development of constitutionalism in the 21st century. And I would like to quote an author that's very dear to me, that the French sociologist Edouard Morin, when he's speaking about the Trinitarian nature of man. He says that we must not consider only 1/3 of the men when we draw a constitution. So not just the individual person, so the man as an individual, not just the man as a social person, but also the man as a natural being, with all the necessity, the need, and the priorities of a natural being. And in this three consideration of the human person that have to coincide always in the same moment, that we always are an individual, we always have social needs, we always have natural needs. We have to breathe, to eat, to survive, and so on. And these three dimensions must come together in the 21st century in the environmental constitution. So if the 19th century was the century of the individual, with liberal constitutionalism, the French Revolution, the American Constitution, and so on, if the 20th century was the century of the democratic constitution, so of the social dimension, with the socialist constitution, but especially with the democratic constitution of the post-Second World War, for example, the Italian constitution, the German constitution, but also the Indian constitution as well. So the constitutionalism of the 21st century should be an environmental constitution with the consideration of the third dimension of them. Otherwise, we'll always think about the structure of liberties, of rights, of constitution in a partial way. We need an integral consideration of constitutionalism, taking care of the three dimensions of man. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Amirante. Truly an eye-opening presentation, something that we should all consider, and almost a hopeful thought to leave with, that maybe the next stage is of an environmental constitution to begin with. Without any further ado, I'd move on to Professor Ladan, the Director General and CEO of Nigerian Institute of Advanced Legal Studies, Abuja and Lagos. Professor Ladan, may I request you to, yes. Thank you so much, Professor Ladan, over to you.
Thank you. It is a very early morning here in Nigeria, Abuja, and I'm glad actually to join you. And I'm also very happy to extend my profound gratitude to our eminent jurist who believes in grooming actually the younger generation and who also believes in bringing together, judges, practitioners, academicians, and then civil society activists together at every opportunity of an international actually program, and that is Honorable Justice Kumar. Thank you very much. I'm glad to see you on the screen, and I'm also glad to honor your invitation. My profound gratitude also to Chandigarh University for inviting me and constantly reminding me to join for this particular important program. And I will be speaking, without wasting much of our time, on the global challenge, or one of the most actually pressing global actually challenges of all times, and that is migration. In the context of why do migrants' life and livelihoods matter in modern times, and what are the key challenges and practical solutions moving forward to address this key global challenge of migration. In my presentation, distinguished panelists, I actually tried as much as possible to ignore the internal migration component because of the theme of the webinar, which seems to actually focus on global challenges of modern times. And so my discussion is going to be primarily on international migration and in reference to migrants' rights to life and livelihood, and what are the key challenges and solutions to address those challenges. Distinguished panelists, I would like to start by actually saying that first and foremost, irrespective of the social, economic, political, and environmental factors or reasons as to why people migrate and where they migrate to, if it is internal migration, we are already aware of the rural to rural migration in our countries, or rural to urban migration, or at times urban to urban migration. But in the international migration context, the key variables are either people are migrating from the southern developing economies to the so-called northern developed economies, or at times largely migration takes place between southern actually developing economies migrants to other developing economies that are within the southern actually region of the global actually environment. Now, irrespective of why and where they migrate to, my argument actually is that migration today is a complex global phenomenon, that is one, and two, it is also a global challenge that provides a practical reality for us to understand why actually it is important for us to find not just solutions to the root causes, but to also be very, very actually pragmatic in terms of our policy and also decision-making processes to address them. The truth of the matter actually is that migration actually today is neither new nor limited to certain region of the world. My second point on this topic is that migration today is a top-tier political issue, complex and also challenging global reality, such that migrants' rights to life and livelihood have become a necessary protection priority for 4 key reasons that I've itemized, for 4 key reasons. Reason number 1 is that because migrants are not only workers, whether legally documented or illegally actually without documentation, but primarily because migrants are human beings. And because they are human beings, their sanctity and quality of life, is at stake. And therefore it is beyond the media portrayal, and it's also beyond the figures that the media, put on their faces, on daily basis in today's actually modern actually times. The second reason why the protection of migrants' rights to life and livelihood have become a necessary protection priority, for both national governments, regional governments, and global community, is because migrants, wherever they find themselves, are essentially a vulnerable group of people in the context of human rights today. And they are vulnerable because they suffer from all forms of discrimination, exploitation, that may be labor, economic, and also even sexual exploitation and abuse. And they also suffer from disadvantage, and they suffer from all forms of actually exclusion from participation in all decision-making processes affecting their lives as human beings. And then more importantly, migrants in international context and in today's global reality, they also suffer from marginalization by age, by gender, by race, by ethnicity, by religion, by status, and so on. My third reason, as to why protection of migrants' rights to life and livelihood in today's global reality is a necessity by all government at all levels, is because the vulnerability of migrants stem from the risks to their lives that they face during their journey from their place of origin through transit countries to their final destination in search of safety and a better means of livelihood or future, not only for themselves, but also for their dependent families. And many of these migrants have died. Some of them have gone missing during their journey, and then some of them have been detained or deported on arrival for lack of documentation, for lack of information, for lack of material resources, for lack of language skills, and for lack of even digital skills. Migrants and have died. They make them easy targets for all forms of exploitation and abuse in the hands of law enforcement and security agencies and paramilitary agencies in either place of destination or in transit countries, or even from the place of origin that they set out of their journey. My fourth reason, distinguished panelists, is that migrant sending countries like India, China, Mexico, Nigeria in Africa, they are also benefiting and they are also interested in diaspora remittances, which plays a key role in their economies. And so migrants are not only fending for themselves and for their families, but from the remittances they also send to their countries of origin. The sending countries are also very much interested in today's international migration because of the remittances from diaspora. And for example, the 2020 World Migration Report reveals the following key facts and figures: that the number of international migrants globally recorded in 2020 report as at 2019 stood at 272 million migrants. That is about 3.5% of the world population, with India coming first with 17.5 million, followed by Mexico with 11.8 million, and China with 10.7 million. These are the top three countries on global migration chart in terms of number of international migrants. Then in terms of the global international remittances from diaspora migrants, to descendant countries, we have the top three recipients again in 2019, reported in 2020 migration report. India taking the lead with having 78.6 billion US dollars remittances from diaspora. China second with 67.4 billion US dollars in diaspora remittances. Mexico coming third with 35.7 billion in diaspora remittances to the economies. And then in sub-Saharan Africa, my country, Nigeria, top on the list with 25.5 billion US dollars in diaspora remittances, which in my country is about 11 times of of FDI flows and about 83% of our entire federal budget in Nigeria. Now, what are the challenges of international migration in today's context? In my view, first and foremost, the challenge number one is the incredibly increasing number or the growing number of international migrants from 150 million in the year 2000 to 272 million migrants in 2019, out of which we had in 2019 164 million migrant workers from about 70 million in 2000, 26 million refugees, 41 million IDPs, and about 4 million stateless persons, all in 2019, from the lower figure of 14 million, 21 million, and 1.1 million, respectively. This actually growing, incredible figures of class of migrants or typology of international migrants create a humanitarian crisis. That is number one. And it also actually provides, a very hard decision-making choices for our national government, regional bodies, and international bodies. Now, reason number two is that, or challenges number two is that all too often the failure or inability or unwillingness on the part of our national government and international governance systems results in a failure to protect migrants' rights to life and livelihood, and a failure to respond to their most basic human needs. Then challenge number three, in my view, has to do with migration policies that have detrimental humanitarian consequences are still being implemented at national and regional levels. For example, in the past 5-6 years, we have witnessed over-reliance on securitization of borders and restrictive migration policies, which themselves resort to detention and curtailment of migrants' rights in host countries, largely aimed at preventing migrants, and then they end up creating hardship and untold suffering, as well as humanitarian crisis. In my view, there are actually some practical solutions that we can look at. And as far as I'm concerned, you can look at solutions from this perspective. One, addressing this global and social phenomenon requires both state or national government to rededicate their commitments to their international law obligations and to adopt and implement migration and sustainable development policies that can take into account the protection of the rights and assistance needs of migrants. Number two solution, in my view, it also necessitates practical cooperation between states, international organizations, civil society organizations, businesses, or the private sector, to also have a very strong synergy or collaboration to address this global reality. And solution number three, in my view, is the need for us to rethink how migration can help achieve Sustainable Development Goals 1 to 15, from gender equality to education for all, poverty reduction, urbanization, climate change, thereby facilitating sustainable development and improving opportunities for all, as opposed to over-reliance on development policies that are only considered as tools to address the root causes of migration, or that seek to provide aid that is normally used to deter migration from low-income countries. Solution number four, in my view, is there is the need for greater attention to be paid by scholars and policymakers on how COVID-19 and information communications technology are changing global migration today in terms of its demographic, labor, inequality, and then global, regional, and national response context. And I thank you very much for your attention and for your listening. These are my few actually thoughts and perspectives on migration challenges, solutions, and way forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Ladan. As always, extremely invigorating talk by you, and truly something that we have to think about, whether our policies are driven towards the goals that we have set for ourselves and are aware of all the issues that we will be facing of the past, present, and the future in relation to migration. So I have also been tasked with the unenvious job of trying to summarize as quickly as possible the wonderful talks given by each of our legal luminaries in the session. We have had a very holistic session where we've covered everything from right to education, to environmental rights, to migration, to climate consciousness. There are philosophical undertones, there are legal undertones, there are rights-based undertones, and probably a way of revolutionizing how we look at environment per se as well that has been discussed. Honorable Mr. Justice Surikant at the very beginning set the tone by talking about education as being a function of physical, cognitive, and psychological development, and not just education how we perceive it to be. We had Justice Mckenna, who so eruditely pointed out how nuclear energy has to be seen as a particular gateway to environmental change and toning down our carbon emissions as a humanity, as a globe. We had Justice Preston, who raised the extremely interesting issue of how does the chicken and egg situation work with society's reaction to law and law's reaction to society, especially from the perspective of climate consciousness. As I mentioned, I'm sure it's going to be a topic for many papers that will be followed. I hope to write one as well on the same. We had Iram Ehsan, who has as eloquently as ever spoken about the vulnerabilities that climate change poses, exasperates, in relation to the already impending vulnerabilities that we've all been facing, how COVID-19 has played its role in further accentuating these vulnerabilities, as she spoke distinctly about the children and women, disabled and elderly people, people who are poverty-ridden and poor, and how they bear the brunt of climate change impacts mostly. And most prominently. And I think she started with the quote saying that they're the first and the worst hit. Then we had Professor Amirante, who absolutely enlightened us with his views on environmental constitutionalism, also gave us a bit of a path that we could follow going forward, and how the next century should be of an environmental constitution, because that's how important the climate emergency that we're facing today is. Finally, we had Professor Ladan, who has spoken so passionately about migration. He's discussed the issues, the four main issues, and then he's also suggested solutions that could be incorporated to come up with policy practicums and policy practical solutions that could be incorporated to somehow address this issue of migration. I think one thing that will stay from his talk is that migration is not just an issue of the past, it's an issue of the present and is going to be an issue of the future, and kind of runs through the track of environmentalism as well, because climate migration, as some of the people already spoke, is something that we all need to be conscious of and something that we all need to worry about as we go forward, and probably come up with policies to address them, as Professor Ladan so rightly put. So in our agenda, our honorable speakers, we have the question answer round that will come next. I request all of our speakers to come online. If you could turn your videos on, and then we'll in a short while go over to the question answers. I again request all of you to come online and please turn on your videos if you could. Honorable Justice Kumar, if you could unmute yourself.
One thing that we don't have still Justice Preston, we don't have Sabrina, Justice Sabrina, I think. Dr. Midha, can you please find out if they are there?
Sir, I think both of them have joined us, sir. Both of them are there. Justice Mckenna and Justice Preston are there.
Okay.
We have all the panelists here, sir.
Okay, but I can't see both of them.
So,
why? Or is it?
I hear Justice Kumar. I think if you were to click on the arrow on the top, you could probably see.
Now I can see you, but I don't know. Preston is still missing, so I would love to have one.
He's very much here.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Sorry, I think I'm not so techno savvy. So that okay, two things which I wanted to say. Firstly, I must, before actually the formal vote of thanks come to you, the question answers you would like to have. We do propose to have a screenshot so that we have the sweet memory of your presence today. But I want to just bring to your kind notice two things, and which I think is a matter of some appreciation the audience you had. It is, we had more than 1,300 direct attendees, and we had to cut short the number because of the connectivity problems. And secondly, there are 28,000 people who have reached out to you in this conference. So I think that shows how popular all of you are on your command and subject that you have done. Most important thing which I wanted to request to all of you, including Honorable Mr. Justice Suryakant in particular, is that when we go out for an in-person conference in May, June or later, hope the global COVID-19 would be better situation with vaccine coming and everything else being in place, then we need to invite all of you to Chandigarh and see this beautiful university and, you know, see the hills of India and work out and give your better lectures to all the concerns and particularly the young generation. I just wanted to interject that and give you this information. Mr. Shan, please, with your all abilities, can you start with the question answer?
My pleasure, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah.
It also gives us a blanket overview of 28,000 people what joining us. So thank you so much. Yeah. And I must also extend a very, very warm gratitude-laden thank you to Justice Kumar. You've made it all possible. So thank you so much.
No, thank you.
Moving on to the question answers. Let me first take up a question by Ms. Manika Bedi. I think Ms. Manika Bedi has a question for Honorable Mr. Justice Suryakant, Judge of the Supreme Court of India. Ms. Bedi, if you could go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, Your Excellencies. Topics like environment and its impact on climate consciousness were touched in the speeches here today, which also bring us to the basic human right to exist in a dignified manner. So my question is to Your Lordship, Honorable Justice Suryakant ji. I would like to know your take on this specifically. International human rights law has been important as it helps in solidifying the international language of human rights in local discourses. However, it lacks direct coercive enforcement mechanisms, which in turn challenge the strength of the international laws. Your Excellencies, with that being said, how can we expand the applicability of human rights in areas where they have limited advocacy?
See, it's a very pertinent question which you have raised, Ms. Bedi. The expansion of human rights is a kind of responsibility on all the stakeholders. I think the judiciary, the civic society, the educationist, academia, and everybody will have to play a very proactive role in popularizing and in ensuring that the human rights, wherever we find out the violations or wherever we notice that the human rights are not being recognized and valued in the way they deserve to be, I think we need to step in through a proactive action that is required. And judiciary, no doubt, can play a very vital role in this regard, because the power of judicial review, particularly with the constitutional courts in various jurisdictions, in India and outside India, those courts can really play a very vital role in this regard. But we need a very vigilant and wise citizenry for that, those who must come forward and point out and rake up all these issues and give a platform for appropriate directions and adjudications.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. And thank you so much, Ms. Bedi, for asking such a pertinent question. We have Dr. Radhika Dev Verma next with her question. Dr. Radhika, if I could invite you to go ahead with your question and also kindly direct it towards the concerned person.
Yes, thank you very much. Good afternoon, Your Excellencies. Your Excellencies, I wish to seek your valuable opinion regarding the right to education as highlighted by His Excellency, Honorable Justice Surikant, Judge Supreme Court of India, that today the age pertaining to free and compulsory education to children in India is about 6 years to 14 years. Should the legal framework be pertaining to the same take in its gamut, even children above 14 years, especially extending the right to the students till 12th standard, as it being the basic educational requirement for employment today?
I think we'll have to call upon the combined wisdom of all of our panelists to answer such a difficult question. If we could go to Justice Surikant first and probably also invite Justice Mckenna later to reflect upon some of the educational challenges that have been faced in the West.
Yes, the question is very important. It's very contemporary issue that has been raised and it needs to be dwelled upon. What I would like to say, and you must have heard when I was speaking, that so far as the Indian law regime is concerned, the Constitutional Bench of the Supreme Court in J.P. Unnikrishnan case has said that up to the age of 14, in any case, there is a state obligation. And beyond that, it depends upon several circumstances, including the financial capacity of the state. But you rightly say that the right to, first I would like to say that it's not the question of simple a rigid or a conventional method of right to literacy. Right to education is a larger issue, it's a bigger issue. And I would like to say that I will lay more emphasis on right to education instead of right to literacy only. And therefore, the young generation of above the age of 14 years and that vital part of the life where you formation part of the life, we need to provide a good quality education. We must ensure that that education is at affordable if it is not totally free, and every person, every strata of the society can join that education institutions or platforms which we are able to create. And we must ensure that this is the only way to provide the concept of inclusive growth of the society. And therefore, I support the idea that we should march towards a mechanism through the state, through the legislation, through the judicial interpretation, and through various kinds of other supports, that the young persons above the age of 14 are also provided adequate qualitative education so as to really convert them into the actual human empowerment.
Thank you so much, Justice Kant. Let me also bring in Justice Mckenna here and let me also fine-tune the question a little for Justice Mckenna. So there's the general issue of promoting education as it is a global concern as it is, but also a bit of your experience with promoting environmental education. I know that University of Hawaii takes environmental education very seriously. There's also this climate consciousness just by virtue of being from a state that is endangered by the impacts of climate change. So let me also add an angle of environmental education to Dr. Radhika's question.
Thank you. Yes, that is an excellent question. One thing that I need to make clear is that we have a federal form of government, and there are certain issues that are a matter of federal law. There are certain issues that are a matter of state law. Mandatory or compulsory education is generally a matter of state law. In general, most states require compulsory education, free public education from ages about 6. I think if you turn 6, and it depends on the state, 6, if you turn 6 by December 31st, you have to start school by the fall of that year, by about August or September. And most states, the compulsory education by state law only goes until 16. The state of Hawaii goes until the age of 18. So we have mandatory free public education until age 18, which basically allows for mandatory free education until one graduates from high school. Not everyone graduates, but you do have mandatory free education. There is an issue of federal law under the federal, I believe it's Americans of, it could be the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. If you require special education, for people with usually cognitive disabilities, the law requires that free mandatory education be provided until age 21. So there is that, also that. With respect to environmental education, I'm not aware of it being a mandatory course in the primary or secondary. But as you say, there are many courses that, my children's schools dealt with environmental issues by having people do special projects, or in their science classes or in their social studies classes to discuss environmental issues. Obviously in Hawaii, there are many courses that deal with environmental issues, and there are many law schools, including the University of Hawaii, that have very strong environmental law programs.
Thank you so much, Justice Mckenna, and thank you, Dr. Verma Arora, for asking such a pertinent question. I must also bring to something springs in my mind. I remember Justice Kumar in one of his famous speeches had said that you educate a child about environment and you educate one whole family. As we say about you educate a woman and you educate one whole family, it works in terms of environmental education, it works both ways. Educating a child is creating awareness at the grassroots level, and that awareness then spreads. So again, a very pertinent question, and thank you, Dr. Arora, again. And thank you, Justice Kant and Justice Mckenna for such gracious answers. Let me call upon Ms. Rahat Malhotra, who's next in the queue for Mr. Rahat Malhotra, who's next in the queue for the question.
Good afternoon to the honorable dignitaries. My question is to Honorable Justice Sabrina Mckenna. Your Excellency, when we talk in the Indian context, recent research demonstrated that about 75% of Indian districts are vulnerable to extreme climate events. Although India's performance at international climate negotiations suggests that it is well aware of the consequences of climate change, still, as pointed out by your good self, India is still increasing its nuclear capacity. Your Excellency, in your opinion, what preventive measures do you suggest should be taken in order that India can maintain a balance in the environment along with progressing towards development?
That's a very excellent question. We have the same issue in the United States, obviously, but we have increased our reliance on various forms of renewable energy. As I think, to me, India, you have such, and Chandigarh, all the patents, you have such intelligent people. One of the issues I understand, and I'm not an expert in this, but one of the issues that I understand, one of the problems with, for example, solar energy, is that it takes too much space to put the panels on. But the technology keeps improving, that you need you need smaller panels to be able to collect more and more energy. Now, the problem I see also in India in terms of solar energy, unfortunately, is the air pollution. I don't know exactly how that works for that, but we in Hawaii have a very, very strong solar and photovoltaic program. I believe that we are the state with the highest number of private residences that are powering themselves with photovoltaic energy on their own rooftops. My house is the same. so we are in the United States and in Hawaii in particular, we are really moving toward renewable energy. So photovoltaic, windmills, and of course there's hydroelectric, which is considered, I believe, a renewable energy form, but I'm sure there are additional issues that come with hydroelectric energy in terms of there are other environmental issues that come with creating dams and destroying the normal flow of a river, that type of thing. So there are other issues. In terms of nuclear, you know, it was really interesting when I decided to speak on this topic. I started reading a lot. And I tell you, I come from Japan, the only country to ever have been bombed with nuclear bombs. And I come from a state. Our state constitution will not allow nuclear power unless 2/3 of each of our two houses, our state legislature, there has to be a 2/3 vote for there to be nuclear energy in the state of Hawaii. I don't think that'll ever happen in the state of Hawaii. And I think it's partly because we're so small that if we had a nuclear accident, where would we go? Because when you think about, you know, like what happened to Chernobyl, I believe it was like 30 miles, 50 kilometers that became uninhabitable. People had, you know, there's a lot of people that had to move away. Same thing has happened in Fukushima when you have an accident. But, you know, the more I read about it, the more I started thinking, you know, India may need to seriously consider completely expanding its nuclear energy. And to me, it could be, I don't know how long it takes to recoup the costs of a nuclear power plant, but it seems to me that while you developed better other technologies like photovoltaic or windmills or whatever it might be, you know, different types of renewable energy. When I was in law school, I edited a law review article on ocean thermal energy conversion, the idea of transferring the water up and down and how you get energy out of that. We have a geothermal power plant on the Big Island of Hawaii with volcanic energy. So there's different ways of doing this, but I think you in India, you have so many intelligent people that are so hardworking and so motivated that and for you young people, this is what I keep saying in these international seminars, you can actually make money from this. You can actually create jobs. You know, President Biden is now talking about green jobs, the green economy. This is the wave of the future, and everybody needs to say, we have to do this. We can't keep going the way we are. Thanks for the question.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Justice Mckenna, and thank you, Rahat. Excellent question. In fact, I'd also invite you to look at the economics of public utilities in India and the grid structures. I think that's one of the issues. One other thing that people usually do not consider is that even renewable energy has its environmental impacts. So solar farms, wind farms, hydroelectricity, all of these also come with its own environmental impacts. But we'll be happy to continue the conversation beyond this session as well if there's any need. I'd invite Mr. Madhusudan Dwivedi, who has the next question. If I could invite Mr. Dwivedi to ask his question, please.
Yes, good morning, everyone, Your Excellencies, and it is honestly a personal pleasure to be a part of this webinar and witness and the extent to which there are people passionately caring about humanity and civilization and the challenges we are facing to be on a better path, to leave a better tomorrow for the next generation, do our bit and role for it. Now, my question, this next question concerns the migration policy in context of the ongoing COVID-19 crisis. We have heard from many of you that how the migrants play an important role in the economic development and growth of not only the countries that they're visiting, but or maybe the places that they're visiting and working, but also their homeland where they come from, as Professor M.T. Ladan was nicely pointing out earlier. So We know that these migrants tend to live and work in crowded conditions, and it makes it difficult to maintain social distancing. And this puts them at an increased risk of contracting this disease. So therefore, what factors should the policymakers consider when designing and implementing migration-sensitive policies with the backdrop of pandemic situations like the current COVID-19 or anything that could happen in the future?
Thank you so much, Mr. Trivedi. In fact, this is a question that can be taken up by anyone in the panel. I'd first go to Professor Ladan because he specifically spoke about migration as an issue, but I think Iram also touched upon climate migration as an issue, and I think Justice Brian Preston's overarching theme of climate consciousness also, and given the fact that he is hailing in from New South Wales, which is close to the Pacific Island nations. So he probably also have a couple of views on this topic. So let me go to Professor Ladan first, if that's okay.
Yes. Thank you very much for the important question. And I think my response to this question will simply be, there are essentially 5 practical ways that COVID-19 is changing global migration. And therefore, if we are looking for a solution, then we have to actually address, those actually issues or ways. First and foremost, we all know that migrant labor, which is the engine of globalized economy, has stopped moving. I mean, there are travel restrictions. We have securitization of borders. With or without COVID-19, it started actually 4, 5, 6 years ago across the globe. And with COVID-19, more national and regional government across the globe are intensifying their border restrictions. They are actually, intensifying their securitization justification with a view to actually deter or prevent more migrants from moving. Already COVID-19 has halted movement of labor. So if you really actually want to address this particular element, then we have to look at, the role actually of International Migration Organization, for instance, in tracking on day-by-day basis the shutdown of global mobility pathways. And each day, countries get more restrictive, requiring more people to move from more places to be quarantined for longer period on arrival. Somebody's already traveling, he's already stressed out in his journey from the place of origin through transit, then to destination, and then on arrival, if he scales through all documentation processes, he gets quarantined for 14 days. So in essence, unless for this particular element of COVID-19 impact on global migration, unless you actually begin to devise another strategy of making migrants to reskill, so reskilling. Migrants must have new digital skills. And we have to find a way of ensuring that their digital skills, can make them actually be highly mobile, and they can also be on demand. So we have to reskill our migrants. And that is very, very important. And so technology has provided the way forward for us to actually, just like we are having this webinar, ordinarily, we'll have gotten actually, a way of spending actually money to travel, and then we actually scale through all the travel restrictions. But today, technology has enabled us, to address the challenge, of all the COVID-19 protocols and guidelines required, and in essence, we are even performing better, and we are maximizing time, we are saving resources, we are saving energy, but then we are also at our best in terms of deliverable outputs. So this is actually one way. So the second way that I also believe is to look at the global inequality that has increased and is still increasing. Global inequality has already reached its highest level in history when COVID-19 hit the whole world. But as of January 2020, 2,153 people, held more wealth than the world's poorest 4.6 billion. Who are the richest people actually in the context of COVID-19 today, where global migration has almost stopped moving? The pharmaceuticals and the tech giants. in just 3, 6 months or 9 months in the COVID-19 era, people actually have made 16 to 24 billion US dollars, as tech giants and as pharmaceutical companies. Now, the question is, if you are a nurse, a medical doctor, if you are actually, a technician, an electrical engineer, a computer engineer, must you necessarily migrate in terms of physical journey, or it is your skill that is needed digitally for you to operate and then make money and at the same time contribute to actually sustainable development or the economy of any nation where you intend to migrate in terms of final destination? So digital skill is key for us to contribute to make our quota and to make money, as professionals, but necessarily as skilled migrants today. So we have to be digitally skillful. These are actually some of my thoughts, and I believe we'll have more time, in the near future to discuss in detail. But I believe that there are 5 key ways by which COVID-19 has impacted international migration, and each of these 5 pathways must be addressed, using technology. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Ladan. Iram, if you could give your thoughts on it, because even during your lecture, you touched upon the Pacific Islands and the climate migration crisis.
Yeah. I think, thank you, Mr. Dwivedi. That was a brilliant question. And Professor Ladan, thank you for answering it so well. You've got your solutions, Mr. Dwivedi. I just want to add, I'm not a technical expert or a scientist or for that matter, environmentalist. I'm a lawyer who has, I always disqualify my answers because I'm not an expert. But, and I give you your answer from my perspective is that if you want to have a policy that can foresee into future, given this pandemic situation right now we are in, which we had never thought we will. And even if I had ever thought about a pandemic, I thought, Spanish flu came and went. It took them 2 years to find a solution. We are much advanced scientifically. If something happens here, it will be a matter of a week and we'll be out of it. Ain't gonna happen as it seems. So given this situation, what policymakers have to see is that they actually consult with those who have suffered the issue before they come up with the relevant policy. Now talk to people who are living 14 people in one 4x4 room in this pandemic social distancing required situation in poor countries. Ask them, consult with them before you make a policy on COVID-19 type of situation. Ask the people of those poor countries, including women, children, elderly, and all the vulnerable people, what do they suffer with and what do they need in the policy? So consult widely, diversely before you come up with a policy, and that will give you solutions in itself. It's, as I always say, it's not rocket science, right? And lastly, what I want to just touch upon on COVID-19. Yes, COVID-19, as Professor Ladan rightly said, that it has shown us grave inequalities and discrimination at the proportion that we had never seen before. At the same time, as recently I spoke to Dr. Mary Robinson, and she said something beautiful. She said, first she told us 5 negative impacts of COVID, and then she gave us tens or more positive impacts of COVID. And one thing that stayed with me was the impact of COVID-19 is the compassion of the people that has come out hundreds of folds. We have seen how people have joined hands to help others, to where governments could not, of course, in poor countries could not come fully, So we as people have shown the love and compassion for people like never before. So that's what happens when you consult with people at a regular level. But Professor Ladan, I want to add that there are certain people and certain communities who had no choice but to migrate even in this COVID situation. And so when we talk about migration and COVID might have stopped the movement, but certain people are still, there. So consult widely. They will give you solutions. That's my simple answer.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Dwivedi. Again, a brilliant question, very pertinent. Again, I'm almost saddened by the fact that we have so little time and such invigorating questions coming in. We have Miss Susanna George next. I think you have a question, Susanna. Would you like to go ahead with your question?
Sure. Thank you so much. A very good afternoon to Your Excellencies. I am Susanna Augustine George, Faculty of Law at Chandigarh University. As Honorable Ms. Iram Hassan has stated in her address, that there is a tremendous increase in the rate of human rights violation around the globe due to COVID and climate change. We have been fighting a global pandemic for almost a year now, and we know that this is not a time to neglect human rights. It is a time when, more than ever, human rights are needed to navigate this crisis in a way that will follow us as soon as possible, to focus again on achieving equitable, sustainable development and sustaining peace. In this regard, how has the battle against the pandemic affected human rights all over the world?
That's an excellent question, Ms. George. Let me get in Justice Preston, because he has recently ruled, as he was talking about in his presentation as well, about climate change. And when a case regarding environment comes up, as Justice Preston was already discussing, you obviously have the right to livelihood that has to be brought into the picture. You have the right to life that has to be brought into the picture, right to conduct business, profession, occupation, trade, all of those things. Now, when a certain element like the pandemic also comes within, and you have to, as a judge or as a private citizen, you have to choose between, say, an environment or public safety, or though you have to make those choices. How do you differentiate between different factors that play in that role? Because it's a very unenviable job, I assume.
Let me answer it in a rather general way, and I'll pick up both this particular question, but also some of the earlier ones. And I'm going to use a little phrase which has struck me in these times, and that is, there is a silver lining in the coronavirus cloud. And it's a point Iram picked up as well, that what the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us is obviously things that are horribly going wrong, and the infringement of human rights and the consequences for people. But they may have been always there, but they haven't been brought to the surface. And so that's the silver lining. We're able to see what was there before. Now comes, what are we going to do about it? And it has been a very interesting response. If we just take this for a moment, all around the world, the governments have moved literally heaven and earth. They have gone from running surplus budgets to deficit budgets. There has been so much fiscal stimulation going on where they said that that was impossible. So we know that, to use another slogan, where there's a will, there's a way. We've seen the governments respond to this pandemic, and that shows it is possible. So come back to another crisis, the climate crisis. There always was the ability to respond to it. They gave reasons why they shouldn't do that. But we can see from the COVID pandemic that it is possible to do it. So now what we can do is, let's learn from this COVID pandemic as to what we can do. Now, I'm going to have a little sort of sidestep, but it's going to be related. It's one of the principles of sustainable development, and it's concerned with the economic concept of externalities. And so an externality in economics is where somebody causes a cost to another person, but doesn't bear the cost themselves. Pollution is a classic one. So a factory belches out pollution. People who breathe in that pollution or have their rivers or crops affected by the pollution suffer. They bear the cost of it. But the polluter doesn't pay. What we need to do is cause an internalization of that externality, That is, in using the pollution example, the polluter pays for it. But so often, why the market doesn't respond to externalities is because imperfections in knowledge in the market. That is, people don't recognize the externality. They don't recognize that somebody else is suffering that cost. So let's take one of the previous questions where it was said that migrants may be housed in spaces where you're used 14 people in a particular small room, or in migrant camps, or not in any camps at all, just under bridges or on rivers or wherever they can squat. They can't social distance. They can't comply with whatever the government's requirements are for hygiene and safe distancing. What the COVID has done is expose that. There always was that problem, but we overlooked it. We didn't see it. Now we see it. So now, having seen it, we need to internalize that and put it back into our strategic policy making, our decision making, both at the legislative, executive, and, coming to your question, Professor, judicial decision making. We need to see it. So it's a very broad answer, but what I'm really seeing here is that out of the COVID pandemic, there will be some good coming out of it. And we need to recognize that and move at the moment and not overlook it when the pandemic passes. Take and learn from this crisis and then adapt our governance and systems for the better. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, sir.
Shall I add something to this topic? Yeah, from Europe, because I think it's quite interesting how Europe responded to the pandemics. First of all, I have to underline that this kind of solidarity that you mentioned in other parts of the world was very strong in Europe, and you can see it by the global European campaign for vaccination. That we managed for the first time, maybe since the existence of the European Union, to organize for all the countries of the European Union a quite equitable campaign for vaccination with one central distribution of vaccines all over Europe. And I think it's very important. It was a very important response in terms of human rights, because even poor countries of Europe are now can have a real and important vaccine campaign. Of course, there are some problems with Pfizer or different vaccines and so on, but the principle is there. And so this reaction of Europe shows also some interesting things about environmental law. Then we can see that in Europe, where there were some, we have studied a little bit the situation, where there were some green constitutions, there were less rollbacks due to the pandemics than in other countries like USA or Canada, where there was there were a lot of rollbacks. USA, for example, has nearly dismantled the EPA, the Agency for the Protection of the Environment, with many cases also treated by some state courts or the Supreme Court. So while in Europe the rollbacks were kept a little bit. So that's one reflection. Second reflection is that the response of the European Union to the pandemics was to increase funds for the climate transition. All the recovery fund is based on financing very much the climate transition. So green ways to produce energy, green jobs, and so on, with some very specific funds. I can just enumerate them: the Next Generation Fund, for example, the Just Transition Fund, that is a specific fund for the climate transition. It is addressed to the more carbon prone economy to change and convert to green energy, and also the recovery plan against COVID-19 is really based on this idea that there has to be a climate transition. So I think, like for other parts of the world, the pandemic has also accelerated the conscience about certain problems, and the climate change maybe will be less will have less damages after the pandemic.
Thank you so much, Professor Amirante. Thank you so much, Justice Preston, and thank you, Ms. George. I think that was an excellent question.
Thank you so much,
Again,
sir.
it doesn't happen very often that you're talking about COVID-19 and climate change, and we get to end on an optimistic note. So I'll just leave it there and quickly invite Mr. Dipender Singh for our vote of thanks. Before he does go on with the vote of thanks, let me also apologize on behalf of the organizers to all the panelists, because we've gone a little overboard with the time, but it's just that with such interesting discussions and interesting questions, we get a little greedy, and that's about it. I'll turn it over to Mr. Dipender Singh for his final vote of thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Dipender Sandhu, and I'm the head of International Relations Program. And on behalf of our Chandigarh University, I would like to propose a vote of thanks to all the distinguishing guests and speakers present here with us today for speaking on this webinar and on the theme Global Challenges in Modern Times. I would like to take this moment to thank the distinguished judge of Honorable Supreme Court of India, Justice Suryakant, for being the chair, and Honorable Justice Sabrina Mckenna, Associate Justice Supreme Court of the State of Hawaii, for being the co-chair of this conference. I also thank the Honorable Justice Swatantra Kumar, former Judge, Supreme Court of India, and former Chairman, National Green Tribunal, New Delhi, and Chairman of the Academic Advisory Board in Chandigarh University, for providing the guidance for the event and for an address filled with profound wisdom and knowledge. I feel deeply indebted to the distinguished speakers, Honorable Justice Brian Preston, Chief Judge of the Land and Environment Court of New South Wales, Honorable Mrs. Irum Hassan, Advisor, Office of the Compliance Review Panel, Asian Development Bank, Philippines, Honorable Professor Domenico Amirante, Director of the Doctorate School in Comparative Law, and Honorable Professor M.T. Ladan, Director General and CEO, Nigerian Institute of Advanced Legal Studies, for having shared the profound wisdom and knowledge on the topic Socio-Legal Ramification, Right to Education in Modern Times in India. I'm sure that your inspiration and advice will greatly motivate the bright minds of the future. Now, I believe that education in its most literal sense is the true soul of society, for it can be passed on from one generation to another. I also believe that the students and all the audience connected with us today through this medium will take away invaluable knowledge from today's session, but also at the same time shoulder some responsibility on imparting this knowledge onto others. An event of this dimension, ladies and gentlemen, cannot happen overnight. The wheels start rolling months in advance, and I would like to thank all the faculty and the staff for contributing to this webinar. Lastly, I just want to thank all the faculty members and student community from India and abroad for being active participants. Thank you.
Thank you.